Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I tell you, I got a really interesting guy to introduce you to tonight. Scott Beyer is his name. He is the owner of the Market Urbanism Report. He's a journalist. He's a consultant. He's a public speaker. He's a free market urban policy advocate. And for many of you that follow me, you know that I'm really interested in urban affairs and what's going on. And I've had a lot of different people on in regards to urban planning and politics from a municipal standpoint, et cetera. And Scott has not only been a commentator on market urbanism, but he's now launched a 1.5-year world tour so that he can actually see different urban environments, urban structures, urban politics in different places. And he's been reporting on that. So I wanted to check in with him and see how the tour is going and what he's learned. Scott Beyer, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Brian.
So tell us, why embark on a 1.5-year world tour?
Yes, it's a 1.5-year tour of the Global South. So Global South being a moniker for, you could say, the developing world in the Southern Hemisphere. I'm going to be spending 6 months in Latin America, which I'm already about halfway through that, 6 months in Africa, and 6 months in Asia, ending the trip in late 2024 when I fly back from Tokyo, which is my last stop, to the United States.
My God, that's quite the trip. Like, how do you take 1.5 years out of your life and go and do that?
Well, I'm a remote worker, so I'm one of the rising crop of digital nomads. All of the work from Market Urbanism Report, which is my media company, is remote. All of my employees at that company are remote. So we write articles and we get grants and we have other ways that we make money through consulting fees and everything like that. And all of it is remote. So I just thought, this is the last couple of years of my life before I want to settle down somewhere and start a family. And so it's kind of like the last chance to see all these global cities that I've always wanted to see.
Fantastic. And what are you learning so far?
Well, I'm 3 months into the trip and it's been the Latin American leg. So my first stop was Mexico City, and I'm going down further south through Central America so far and further into South America. So I'm currently in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is the 7th stop on this 50-city tour around the world. And what I'm learning so far is that, it's a lot of different things and there's a lot of different themes we can go into. But really the thing that jumps out is just how cheap these cities are financially, if you're for the consumer, and how, in my mind, they provide arguably a better experience in many ways than a lot of the cities in the Western world. And for example, in Canada and the US, the best cities in those countries are quite expensive and they're not affordable to the average person. And yet you can go to Mexico City or Medellin, Colombia, and get a beautiful lifestyle. And it's literally like, if you factor housing costs and all the costs of the consumer goods, it's literally like 1/10 the living cost, or you might even say less. And it's providing the same quality of life. A lot of the high-profile public safety issues are not necessarily an issue in the rich neighborhoods. And so it just has given me a different perspective on the whole affordable housing problem.
Really, that's fascinating. So, we're in the middle of provincial elections in Ontario in Canada right now, and affordability or lack of affordability is probably one of the number one issues. And a lot of municipal governments are the ones that are criticized for overly restrictive zoning and time for approvals of buildings and things like that, particularly giving into NIMBYism and the desire for lack of density and no new things going into my neighborhood, et cetera. Why is it that the cities that you've been going to have been able to produce far more affordable homes? Is it lack of city governments or different attitudes in city governments?
Well, it's a lot of different things. To be sure, a lot of it has to do with the difference in wealth and currency of a Westerner versus a local in these markets. So me coming in as an American who has an American salary and American USD, our currency goes a lot further in these markets. So it's not as if these neighborhoods that are rich, they might be extremely affordable for me, but they're not extremely affordable for a local. But I think beyond that, yeah, it does seem like they are much more permissive, not just with housing, but like the whole land use paradigm. You walk through a Mexican street and there's uses everywhere, and we can argue like the pluses versus minuses of that. But you have, for example, you can have a building that has a gym at floor level, and then a bakery like right at the ground level in the middle of a residential neighborhood, and then you'll have like a laundry and a car repair shop literally a couple buildings over. So it doesn't appear that there's any sort of zoning to separate uses. And it also doesn't appear that there's any sort of zoning or at least not as tight of a zoning to prevent density and residential density. So I'm seeing cases where and you'll see the renderings as you walk down the street. Medellin, Colombia was another example where you would walk through residential neighborhoods and a developer will have torn down a single family building and is building like a 10-story condo apartment in the middle of this residential area, in the sort of scenario that you would never see in an American city where single family residential zoning has effectively glazed over the entire neighborhood, kept it in kind of this like stagnated state, and you could never just build a tower in these neighborhoods. So I imagine that has a lot to do with it.
Just okay, so let's stop on that one specifically. Is that good or bad?
Well, in my opinion, it's good. And the specific neighborhoods that I'm talking about in Medellin happen to be these very wealthy neighborhoods where that would never happen in the US. And what I think that accomplishes is it means that there's now 10 or 20 times as many units on that specific parcel that people can access. And so it's that many more people getting to live in a centrally located neighborhood with a lot of jobs that is safe. So it's opening opportunity for people.
But in North America, people would restrict that because why? Because they think that if it's a single family neighborhood, it should stay single family neighborhood and you shouldn't have a condo in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, the why of why it would not be allowed in North America is complicated, but because different people have different reasons why they've stopped that. I think ultimately, like the most charitable version would be, if I bought into a single family neighborhood, I should expect that it stays single family because adding the density hurts my quality of life.
Yeah.
But I think the less charitable version would just be like I bought into this neighborhood and I expect government zoning to instill a permanent housing shortage so that my specific unit is more valuable at the expense of making the neighborhood cheaper for everybody else.
Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Scott Beyer, market urbanism reporter, in just 2 minutes. We're going to do a little bit of a canvas of some of the stops and have him comment on some of the cities as he's embarked on this 1.5 year Southern Hemisphere tour. Fascinating. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is a really fascinating gentleman. Scott Beyer is his name. He runs something called the Market Urbanism Report. He's a journalist. He's a consultant. He's a public speaker. He's a free market urban policy advocate. He's a gentleman that I've interviewed before about his urban planning attitudes. And he's now embarked on a 1.5 year trip through the global South. Scott, why are you doing this?
Well, yeah, so I think part of it is that I've spent about a decade almost now as a journalist covering U.S. urban issues from a free market perspective. But I think to expand my coverage of these ideas, I needed to see the world. And so I could have gone to Europe and Canada, but I feel like that has path has been beaten by other urbanists. And I thought, the future is really the global south. The fastest growing cities in the world are in the global south, particularly Africa and Asia. And so in my mind, that's kind of the future. They have a younger population, they have a faster growing population, and it could be possible that they will innovate more in the future than Europe and the United States. As crazy as that might sound, it's not implausible. And so I really wanted to track this area of the world.
And where are you now?
I'm currently in Sao Paulo. That route is a little bit out of date, and I've adjusted it a little bit. But Sao Paulo is now the seventh stop, and some of those other countries, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, will be on the later swing up during my Latin American trip. So I need to update that.
You're going really all the way south through South America, and then you go over to South Africa, and then you sort of work your way north?
Yeah, so it's going to be from July to December of 2022 is going to be Latin America. The first half of 2023 will be Africa, and the second half of 2023 will be Asia.
What an amazing trip. Fantastic. Well, let's talk a little bit about your stop. So the first stop was Mexico City. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mexico City was the first stop. Guatemala City, Honduras, Panama City, 2 stops in Colombia, and now Sao Paulo.
Tell me about Mexico City, if you could. What were your impressions?
Well, Mexico City was a big city. It was like the biggest city that I've been so far. And the things that really stood out, kind of talking about the rich neighborhoods that we had discussed earlier, was there's a handful of cities, La Roma Norte, Palenque, and Condesa, where they had really improved the public space. They had taken a lot of right-of-way away from the automobile, and they had designated it to medians, very tasteful, well-landscaped medians going down the middle of major avenues, and also parklets, which you see in that photo, where instead of having curbside parking by commercial businesses, they removed that and put parklets. So these tiny little businesses that don't have any in-store seating can still seat 15 to 20 people, which I would imagine very much helps the revenue over having a single parking space. Now, I talked about how amazing this was for Mexico City, but what I found while traveling is that a lot of the Latin American cities have this. So this is not unique to Mexico City. Latin American cities, particularly for the rich neighborhoods, but really in general, just have a very different attitude about how right-of-way should be used versus Western societies, particularly in the US. Rather than designating so much space to the automobile, they designate it to make the neighborhood look more attractive and to encourage other types of transportation besides just personal use of cars.
Now, we've done in Canada a fair amount of this because of COVID, where we allowed restaurants and whatnot to have outdoor seating on the parking lane of roadways. But there's a big controversy about whether it should continue post COVID, when people are more comfortable going back indoors and winter weather comes and we think about car traffic increasing again. So you're suggesting maybe this is something that should be year round all the time, COVID or not?
Yeah, I don't think in Latin America it's really even a controversy. That's kind of the perception I get, because as I ask and do more research, a lot of these right-of-way carve-outs are not new. Like the boulevards are old. The boulevards were built, for example, in Mexico City, and a lot of these, like what began as first suburbs of the central area of Mexico City, those medians and parks were built like a century ago. So they had a better sense of how you manage the public realm for quite a while, dating back. And yeah, I mean, I think another thing that, we're talking about themes that I've picked up on the trip so far, and this is kind of related, and it has more to do with the investing angle of my trip as well, but it's also related to the urbanism. and that is the idea of tropical barrios tropicales. So this idea that when you have a rich neighborhood and you want to attract investment to it, both the public sector and the private sector adds tropical botany to the public realm. So the public sector does that in the form of like medians and parklets, as I described. But even a lot of the private businesses are putting like really lush landscape on their balconies and like really attractive seating in front of their stores. And so it has the combined effect of making it feel like you're walking through a jungle when you walk through these places. And the local shrubbery is just amazing.
Local shrubbery. Fantastic. Sounds good. You also commented about, is it taxis or buses in Mexico?
Yeah, and again, that's not a Mexican thing. I would say it's even more prolific in some of the other countries that I've been. But yes, there is a competing network of buses to complement the public sector buses. You know, in the U.S. and I would imagine Canada as well. The whole idea of transit is thought to be a socialized public sector provision, but it's simply not that way. In Latin America, they do have nice public transit in many cases, but they also have like this kind of private sector network of in Mexico City they're called peceros, but they have different names in each country, and they list their route right on right on the bus. Sometimes there's somebody hanging out at the door, a worker who yells out the route and yells the route to people on the street so that they know where the bus is going. And you just go in, they cost like 25 cents USD, and they're kind of like these nimble flex route type buses where if you tell them where you want to go, they'll kind of make provisions for you and maybe go off the beaten path a little bit.
What kind of regulation? Do you have to get a municipal permit for that, or is this completely privatized?
Technically, you do. In the U.S., it's more. Excuse me. In Mexico City, it's kind of regulated, but in many cases, it is not regulated, and and it's literally just some person with a bus who wants to go out and provide a service, and that does come with its problems in the sense that there's kind of these wars for curb space. In some cases, you know, this will be good or bad to somebody depending on what their perspective is. But in Panama City, I saw a crowded public bus stop where a private bus with the aforementioned man yelling out the window about where it's going roll up to the public bus stop and poach a lot of the customers waiting there because it was providing presumably a better service that was going to take them there faster and closer. So yeah, it's created some curb space wars. And as a market-based thinker, I have all kinds of ideas about how a city could solve that sort of problem, but that doesn't appear to have been really addressed in some of these Latin American cities yet.
So you think that some more freedom in providing transit services is good, but then you also showed some pop-up barbershops and other things that were little stores on the sides of streets. So what are you doing? Suggesting that we don't need the whole permitting process and all the health and safety checks that we have in the north?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I think where market thinking would help here, both with the pop-up shops, which like one criticism of the pop-up shops is that if you're a merchant who actually pays rent in the brick and mortar shops, you probably don't like a competitor like literally just forming a tent on the sidewalk right in front of you. So, I think it does lead to very dynamic, diverse urbanism, and it does lead to cheaper prices for the consumers. But I have been told by very reliable sources, because in other countries, for example, in Honduras, if you go to their central neighborhood, you will see like just tent after tent after tent going through their centro of businesses like this, where people sell shoes and shine shoes and sell fruit and give haircuts. And what I've been told is that those are illegal. Those are literally just everyday people invading the area and setting up tents right in front of the formal merchants. So on one hand, that's you might call that market urbanism. On another hand, you might call that complete anarchy. I think as a market thinker, I would look at that and say the city ought to delineate space on the sidewalk and charge for the use of that space, and that would create a more organized system. But overall, I'm a fan. Like I'm not, I'm not down talking the fact that this paradigm exists, and it's very different from what I'm used to in the United States, where everything is like hyper regulated and formulated, and you can't do anything outside of the legal regime that is in place.
Well, I think that Airbnb and Uber and Lyft and people like that have proven that consumers don't actually really value some of our overregulation. They kind of like to regulate based on likes or ups and downs, and whether people have got 5 stars or 4 stars. They think that other consumers, are actually better regulators than the regulators themselves. And I also wonder often about how we make it so much more difficult for people to get started than it would have been in sort of times gone past, when you could, if you were out of money, just start a taxi. And I guess Uber is that opportunity today. Or like this gentleman, open a store. And, if he doesn't have good health standards, the word's going to get out pretty quick, isn't it? And that's pretty good regulation. And if he's got to move to a different location because there's not enough demand, he's going to do that, and he's going to do it more flexibly than if he's got big bricks and mortar. So I'm a firm believer that we should be a little bit more flexible. And I was in New York recently. Some of the street markets were some of the most favorite places to go. And the farmers markets and other markets are people love. So why not? Let's have more of them.
Well, the barbershop photo is particularly fitting because in the U.S., whenever people bring up the problems with occupational licensing in our country, barbers are often the very first thing they cite, because I don't know what it is about that specific industry. Maybe it's just the protectionism and the cronyism, but it's really hard to get a license to be a hairstylist in the U.S. And so to look at Mexico City, where you pay a couple dollars and you just go into a tent on a street and get your hair cut, I don't really, it's not clear to me what the immediate public health threat of doing something like that is. I mean, like, surely the person running, if he can set up a tent, he can handle a pair of scissors. And so it's just like, it's not, they've created it's kind of a security theater in the Western world, where they've created all these phantom security issues that can come from not regulating this or that. And yet Mexico City and the other Latin cities that I go to provide a pretty stark rebuttal to that thinking.
You also commented about sort of these old urban marketplaces. What are they called? Centros?
Centros, yes. So I'm staying in a centro in Sao Paulo right now, and centros are basically just what we would think in the U.S. and Canada as downtown areas. Although they are kind of interesting, they're the old center that was often built in previous centuries. And what I learned about centros is that they're typically considered by locals, they are not considered fashionable. So whereas I would imagine in like a Vancouver or a Toronto, the downtown area is considered like a good place you would want to go out and party or have a weekend out. The centros are not considered fashionable. Most of the wealth of these cities in Latin America have moved out to other newer business districts. But what the centros do represent is they're kind of like a working class place that has a lot of these types of pop-up businesses. They're more popular for the indigenous population. You'll see just business after business after business every single block. And so for me, they're quite fascinating. And sometimes they have crime issues, but I haven't run into anything personally. And they're just like, they're kind of like a sensual bonanza, in the sense that you're going to get sensory overload from an urbanist perspective of all the activity going on in these places, and they're never boring. They're always great places to go.
We're chatting tonight with Scott Beyer, who is the owner of Market Urbanism Report. He's on a 1.5-year Global South tour of cities to report back to us on what's happening in all these different cities. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Scott. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Scott Beyer. He is the owner of the Market Urbanism Report. He's a journalist. He's a consultant. He's a public speaker. He's a free market urban policy advocate. And he's just embarked on a 1.5-year fascinating journey of the Global South, of numerous different cities. I think he said 50 different cities. And he's in South America right now. He's on his fifth or so stop, and I've just been following him, and it's a fascinating trip, and he's been posting some really interesting findings. And not only is he going to the big cities, but he's going to some startup cities. Tell us a little bit about that, if you could, Scott.
Yeah, so I have 50 stops in big cities, and they're kind of my home base when I go to the different countries. They're places you would predict, like Rio de Janeiro and Lagos, Nigeria. But then I have 50 to 100 sub-stops that I'm also embarking on. And the goal there is to go to 50 to 100 startup cities. And startup cities are these little autonomous zones that are being built all over the world. Sometimes they're called SEZs, sometimes they're called special economic zones, sometimes they're called private cities, sometimes they're called zona libres, which is Spanish for free zone. But the idea is that the thing that's really fascinating to me about startup cities from a market perspective is that they're an experiment in building a new type of city that is autonomous and separate from the traditional cities. And they often rely on private governance rather than democratic municipal governance. And so, yeah, I've already been to 7 of these, and my plan is to go to 100 around the world. But they've been really fascinating places to go.
What are the 7?
Well, the first one is I'd say the main ones, the ones that get the most buzz, are actually going down in Honduras, because Honduras established a new special economic zone policy where you can effectively start what amounts to a new country. They're called ZEDEs, which is Spanish for like freedom zone. And the idea is that you carve out space, you come to an agreement with the Honduran government to carve out space, and then you can set your own tax and regulatory policy and effectively run your own nation within the country of Honduras. You just have to pay Honduras a fee every year for the right to do this. That's relatively small. So two of the well-known cities that are that have come from this policy are Prospera, which is a kind of a resort. I want to say it's a resort, but that's kind of underplaying it a little. And that was built on the Honduran island of Roatan. And then there's a second city called Morazan, which is a more industrial city that was that's being built outside of San Pedro Sula, in between, kind of close to the northern port along the coast of Honduras.
And what have you found so far?
Well, what I've found is that they seem to be working really well. Another example would be Cayala, which is built actually within Guatemala City, but had, you're looking at it right there, but had its own. They gave them autonomy on how the city could be planned and zoned. And so Cayala is probably the most successful built out version, simply because it was started earlier. But it's effectively like a Europe, kind of like a new European style city that was built within Guatemala City.
And all the cars were underground?
I'm sorry, what?
All the cars are underground?
All the cars are underground. So there's practically no car infrastructure anywhere. It's planned in such a way that it's very easy for the car to go underground without ever having to touch the surface level of the city. The public spaces, as you see, are very attractive. But I think I think actually the true promise of startup cities, which is might be difficult to relate to from a Western standpoint, but I think is very relatable from a Latin American one, is they have their own private security. They have private policing. And so they are able to be safer than the standard city street in a Latin American city, which is a big deal to Latin Americans because safety is an issue here, particularly in the working class neighborhoods. So as I talked to more locals in Guatemala City, they held up Cayala as an example of a place they could go party and eat dinner on Friday and Saturday night without having to deal with the safety issues of walking around in the dark in Guatemala City proper. So it really goes to show, I mean, private policing is often like branded as this fascist, dystopian type of regime by people who dislike the police. But I think the reality is that if you have private security, they're very often they are less corrupt than the municipal police.
Why would the private police be less corrupt than regular police?
Well, the city founder of Morazan walked me through this because I asked the same question, and basically he said that private security are able to be fired, and there's an incentive when you're a private entrepreneur running a city. There's an incentive to make something attractive and pleasant, and so you're not going to hire private security that's like rude and invasive of people because ultimately they won't want to come to your city. Whereas I don't really think that dynamic, it's sort of like there's so many distorted dynamics that have come about from public policing and municipal policing, everything from they're negligent about certain issues that actually have to do with public safety, but then very often they're very invasive of people about issues that don't really matter. At least that's what I found to be the case.
You also visited some beach towns?
Yeah, I did. So Roatan Island is the one off Honduras that is I thought was a very attractive beach community, although it's something that's like difficult to relate to anything I've ever seen in America because it's kind of a working class beach that appeals to the local Afro Honduran population. And that also, it's kind of a tropical island. It's a very attractive place, in my opinion, and a very culturally interesting place. But then that's also where they're building Prospera, which is the special economic zone that is trying to brand itself as the Singapore of Latin America.
The Singapore of Latin America, really?
Yeah, and that's where the special economic zone policy comes in. So they have tax rates in the low single digits. They have a regulatory policy that is extremely loose. So if I want to go in and build a skyscraper in Prospera, I would be able to do it. There'd be a very limited regulatory code that I would have to follow, some basic environmental laws, but overall I would be allowed to do this. And then I think you'll have to look into it more deeply, but basically there's a lot of what in my mind are legal advantages associated with Prospera. Like they have their own arbitration system, so you're not having to go through government arbitration courts. You're going through theirs, which are based on like private sector principles. And they even, and I think this is really interesting, and I'd be very curious to see what comes of it in the next decade or two, but they have their own financial center. So if you want to start, like, for example, if you want to start a hedge fund in the United States, and at some point I will, I
want to invest. Let me know when you do.
Will do. It's very difficult to start a hedge fund, and I know people who have tried and failed in the U.S. because you're having to go through our Securities and Exchange Commission, which has all these rules and regulations that will cost you tens of thousands of dollars. I'm interested to see what comes of Prospera's because they're effectively trying to start like an exchange, kind of like NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, where you can buy and sell equities and run financial related businesses through their structure that presumably is less regulated than something like the SEC. So I'm really interested to see what comes of that and whether or not it becomes an easier place for for financial entrepreneurs.
You also saw what I would deem poverty, but you actually thought it was good, that it was affordable housing.
Well, yeah. I think the situation that I'm seeing in a lot of these Latin American countries, and it particularly germinates around these special economic zones, is that once a Latin American country establishes a special economic zone, they get a bunch of foreign corporations. So you'll go to certain parts of Latin America. Cartagena, Colombia was one that I saw just this past weekend, where you'll just have tons and tons of factories, huge smokestack style factories that you don't really see much anymore in America. And then what ends up happening is that gravitates people from the rural hinterlands who are very poor. They'll gravitate into the city and work these jobs. And since there's not proper housing to be built for them, they'll effectively just build like these little shanty towns around the factories, and they live in third world conditions within these shanty towns. Like the shanties are often overtaken by drug lords, and they're thoroughly third world in their makeup. And so you might view that as like that's a stark inequality, and that's a really unfortunate situation, which it is. But from the perspective of the people living there, they were living in rural poverty, where they often can't access clean water or anything that we take for granted in the Western world. And so the fact that these factories located in the cities and were built and are providing jobs, and the fact that these rural migrants can then come in and kind of like create their own tent communities is actually an improvement in their lives. And at the same time, it's not something that we in the Western world can really relate to.
You said Panama City has a far higher GDP per capita than some of the other cities that you had visited, but you didn't say why.
Well, I think the most obvious reason would be the Panama Canal. There's just a massive amount of trade that goes through that canal, and it has created all kinds of economic spillovers into Panama City. But I think also they have a higher economic freedom rating. There's more of a mindset of having low taxes and less regulations, and that's evident in the built form that you see in those cities, in Panama City, which is skyscraper after skyscraper.
66 towers above 500 feet.
Yeah, and a lot more below that. There's a lot of like towers in the middle range as well.
What's impressed you the most about the built form that you've been seeing?
I think to go back to the tropical, the barrios tropicales, which is Spanish for tropical neighborhood. That is a real estate subgenre that I have invented whole cloth off the top of my head, but that I ultimately want to bring more publicity to and ultimately invest in. And so the idea of the tropical barrio is the rich Latin American neighborhood where, because of the wealth within the neighborhood, they have really leveraged the tropical botany as much as possible to make an attractive public realm that almost feels like going through a jungle. So again, a lot of this is public sector. It's building parklets, it's building medians, it's building wide sidewalks that have all kinds of publicly managed shrubbery. But quite a lot of it is private sector. It's different businesses wanting to compete for customers. So they make their storefronts as attractive as possible with hanging gardens and wall grass and flowers and all kinds of parklets, all kinds of things that make their streetscape attractive. And the net result is you're just walking through like these beautifully landscaped spaces. The tropical barrios that I have seen that are the best are a combination of Condesa in Mexico City, Zona 10 in Guatemala City, Lorales in Medellin, El Cangrejo in Panama City, and I would say in Bogota, Santa Barbara, although in Campanero, although it wasn't quite up at the level of the others. But by the end of the trip, I'm going to have a list because Africa has a lot of African countries have tropical climates, and then of course Asian countries do too. So I would love to create a real estate genre that compiles tropical barrios all over the world, and makes them places that people can potentially invest in and buy property. Because I think that the collective effort to make these places attractive will always make them valuable as well. I think the real estate will always be valuable in these neighborhoods.
We're chatting tonight with Scott Beyer. He is on a 1.5-year trip of the global south, 50 different cities and 100 different startup cities, to report back to us all about, I guess, urban planning and city government and what actually makes for good cities. Stay with us. We're going to be back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saturday 60. We've been chatting tonight with Scott Beyer. He is an urbanist, a free market urbanist. He publishes a report called the Market Urbanism Report. He's been a journalist about urban issues for the last 10 years. He's a consultant, he's a public speaker, and he's embarked on a 1.5-year trip around the global south. He's in South America now. In a couple of months, he's going to head to Africa. Then he's going to complete the trip a year from now in Asia. And I think it's going to be a fascinating experience for you. I had the opportunity to go to a couple cities in Africa, and I was impressed with the infrastructure development that I wasn't expecting, and some of the vibrancy in the economic sector. And so I look forward to hearing what your reports are about Africa in 6 months' time or so. I've never had the privilege of going to South America, and so I'm really quite fascinated with your tour of not only the major cities, but of what you call these startup cities, which is kind of interesting that so many of them have grown up with more lax regulatory constraints and economic zones for development. It'll be interesting to see what your conclusions are as you go through it. If people want to follow you and follow your exploits in your trip, what's the best way to do that?
They can follow marketurbanismreport.com. There I have a landing page that shows the route. I think, but if you want a more interactive and sort of day-to-day version, follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, and I think above all, the Market Urbanism Report Facebook group. It's an 11,000 person group where I post every single day about the new findings from my trip. And it's really like it not only gets a lot of engagement and commentary, but it's kind of like an ongoing photo essay of my trip, and the new discoveries that I find every day in each of these stops.
Let me ask you a final question, if I could. There was this big controversy, 10, 15 years ago, between, one author who wrote the book, The World is Flat, and said that with global communications, global travel, et cetera, you could live anywhere you wanted. And then, another author, Richard Florida, who said, no, the world is spiky, and New York, London, et cetera, are becoming even more important as people gravitate. Here you are embarked on this trip as a remote worker around the global south, and you're seeing, cities, both startup cities as well as big older cities. What's your sense? Is the world flat or is it spiky?
I'm a fan of both Friedman and Florida, and I don't think either of them were wrong. I mean, I could go all day on this kind of stuff, and it's sort of like answering those questions was one point of the trip. I'd say Richard Florida also had an interesting idea. He wrote a book called Who's Your City, kind of going off kind of like extrapolating on his spiky theory, his spikiness theory of in the future, there's going to be a select number of cities that attracts like the global elite professional class, and they're going to be the winners in the global economy. And he was mostly talking about that from as I recall, from like a Western perspective of this will be European cities and American cities like New York and San Francisco, and they're going to be the ones that attract these types of places. Going through Latin America has given me a new interpretation of his "who's your city" theory, because I look at places like Medellin and Mexico City, and I think to myself, these are uncovered pearls. They should actually be the cities attracting the professional digital nomad class, because they're so much cheaper. And I think honestly, you could argue they have a better lifestyle, just depending on what you define as good lifestyle. I think they are right up there with the New Yorks and San Franciscos and Vancouvers and Torontos.
Better lifestyle because it's more affordable, or what?
No, even putting price aside, like I think that just the urban design, they have really interesting cultures, they have great music, they have, like really nice people, and it's just good restaurants. They have all the things that the New Yorks have, and arguably they have them better. They do certain things better. And so obviously if you're trying to raise kids and you're having to deal with like the language barrier, the schools and everything, that becomes an issue. But that's not even the demographic Richard Florida was talking about. I think he was talking about people like me who are young and single and just want interesting places to live. What cities are going to attract those types of people? And I'm frankly surprised that the superstar Latin American cities have not attracted more people from outside of Latin America to live that sort of lifestyle.
Scott Beyer, Market Urbanism Report, on his year-and-a-half trip through the Global South, reporting back to us on the success of some of those cities, both the startup cities as well as the big cities, and just giving us an interesting view of South America. Really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brian.
We'll try to check back with you in a couple of months and see how the trip's going.
Yeah, feel free. I'd love to have it be a semi-normal, update thing.
Fantastic. That's our show for today, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at saga960am.ca, even from South America if you want. And all my shows are on podcasts, on Apple, Audible, Speakeasy, etc. And all my shows are on video on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Good night.